Insecurity, secrecy, corruption, lies. Decades of decadent decision-making erupted in 1986 after a failed security test blew the nuclear reactor of Chernobyl wide open. In this particularly unlucky timeline, over half of the nuclear material was blown open, preventing the emergency response in the middle of the night. Before long, the fire reached the diesel generators, and the entire facility was engulfed in this radioactive inferno. The poison seeped into the groundwater and was carried in every direction by the winds, kindling the nationalistic spirits which were already on the edge. But despite the name, the Fallout Wars which reshaped humanity were not started because of radiation, but fear. Sheer hysteria, which spread faster and further than the nuclear clouds. The catalyst for this reaction? The same one as in 1914, a political assassination. While visiting his family, Mikhail Gorbachev was gently poked by the umbrella of an unknown KGB agent. The tip contained ricin, and before long, the Soviet Union went from being in a crisis to going into free fall.
Hey Cody, things sure are getting kinda crazy out there. We'll just have to stay here for a little bit.
That's okay, Jimmy. I have a strategy.
Oh, really? A plan on how to survive?
No, I have a strategy game in the mobile game, Conflict of Nations World War III, the sponsor of today's video.
Wait, what?
Conflict of Nations World War III, the sponsor of today's video.
The enemy troops are at the gates.
World War III is here, and it's up to you to pick your nation to lead to victory in this free online PvP strategy game. Declare war on your neighbors, or make alliances. It's all up to you, in conflicts that may wage for weeks on end.
My Geiger counter is going off. I think the radiation is seeping in.
Said in the modern day, you can use current military units for your advantage, like nuclear submarines, tanks, jets, and more. You can even use the same account on PC or mobile. By clicking on the link in the description, you get an exclusive gift, 13,000 gold, and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for the next 30 days though, so don't lose time.
Oh wow, that sounds like a really good game. Hey, is there another bunker we can flee to?
Why is that, Jimmy?
Oh, nothing. It's, I just think that artillery salvo's coming our way.
Oh! The Perestroika was the most radical series of reforms since the death of Stalin, and since it had only been a year after their introduction, their only outcome was splitting the Soviet Union into a conservative and progressive camp. But now Chernobyl was here to turn that split into an all-out fracture. Any general with an army in his pocket became a warlord, reigning over a swath of land in the middle of a geopolitical calamity. Prior to its collapse, the semblance of a centralized Soviet Union had sent a large army to deal with the rebellions in Ukraine and Belarus, as those territories were integral to its existence. But when the head of the reigning party was chopped off, dozens of factions attempted to seize power. Despite this being a sequel, chosen by the audience in the previous poll, there are too many factions to cover in a single video, so let's stick with the most prevalent ones. Picture this. If the USA and the Soviets ever duked it out, Germany was the heavyweight ring where the gloves would come off first. That's why the Warsaw Pact had their biggest stash of weapons there. In '86, the Soviet Union was flexing with the world's largest army, boasting 3.8 million troops, more than Uncle Sam, France, Italy, and the UK put together. Of its 40,000 modern tanks, over 7,000 of them, most of which were T-64s, were stationed in East Germany. Alongside them, you got 340,000 Soviet soldiers and their extended families, and Khrushchev was their direct military leader. Within a year, all of them would receive the news that a nuclear reactor was spilling poison headed their way. Ukraine and Belarus were in an open rebellion, and now their supreme leader was dead. Cut off from the motherland, they would cling on Peter Khrushchev and follow his every command. Khrushchev wasn't just any military man. He was a hardliner. Gorbachev's reforms? Nope. Chernobyl debacle? Hated it. When the Soviet government went off the rails, he decided to take charge. Ring any bells? It should. Khrushchev's tactics mirrored those of Kolchak, complete with cozying up to the west. While Reagan celebrated the Soviet meltdown, he also knew that a country with the world's largest nuclear arsenal going rogue was a nightmare scenario. So he made a deal with Khrushchev, legitimize him as the Soviet leader, and provide a safe passage through the Baltic Sea, backed by naval support from the US and UK. In return, a unified Germany. The Archangels had a powerful base with a unique cultural identity from the north, but more importantly, possessed the largest and most organized military force out of any other faction. The Berlin Wall was torn down, and Germans cheered on as their occupiers were now laying siege to Leningrad, with aid from the West. But who exactly were they fighting against? In our timeline, the 1991 coup was a bloodless flop, but in this 1987, things took a darker turn, even though it had support from similar factions within the Soviet government. This committee, following the murking of Gorbachev, declared martial law and seized power. They paraded themselves as a provisional government, promising to tidy up Chernobyl and ensure a smooth transition to new leadership. But behind the facade lay the conservative elite, exploiting the chaos to shore up their grip on power. While the outlying regions had already peeled away, Moscow and other key centers still clung to the hope of restoring order by any means necessary. Losing Belarus and Ukraine to rebels would be a catastrophe, and the initial knee-jerk reactions had left swaths of soldiers and equipment stranded deep within irradiated zones. Thanks to wind pattern and geography, the routes from Minsk and Kiev to Moscow were laced with radiation. The troops tasked with suppressing the rebels morphed into anarchic fallout survivors, scavenging whatever they could find. To gain legitimacy and placate the general public, the SOEC shut down all operational nuclear reactors and armed 24 battalions with one clear goal: hunt down every raider they could find, to be displayed on the Red Square. These groups came to be known as the Liquidators, and also had a covert secondary task, carefully coordinated by the KGB: wipe out any vocal opposition to the provisional government. This gave the committee the stability necessary to tackle larger problems, and early in 1988, they mobilized the vast military from all the bases around Moscow. Within months, a blitz attack engaged against the numerous republics to the east and south. The Don Republic had its capital of Rostov leveled to the ground, just to set an example. After that, the Chuvash and Mariel republics quickly surrendered and defected to the committee. Then, nearly 2 years after Chernobyl, the Battle of Saransk dealt a blow to the dreams of a revitalized Soviet Union. Led by Sergei Arkhamayev, a retired marshal and head of the Republic of Mordovia, the defenders repelled the enemy with cunning tactics, inflicting heavy losses. This became a rallying cry, and led to the formation of the United Republics of Russia. The combined strength of the 9 republics made them into the third formidable faction in the Fallout Wars, and together they ruled over a large population with vast amounts of resources. Around this juncture, the protracted negotiations between the Archangels and the West reached a climax, just as Peter's formidable 300,000-strong army executed a pincer movement on Leningrad. Forces descended upon the junta government from Archangelisk itself, as well as Finland and the Baltic Sea. It was very reminiscent of World War II, the city defiantly holding its ground for a grueling 4 months. But with determination, and bolstered by Western supplies, it emerged victorious. The Archangels celebrated the liberation of Russia's second largest city, while the URR made strides by conquering Yaroslavl. Sensing the looming siege of Moscow, the emergency government withdrew from the ravaged Don Republic, opting to fortify their defenses against the impending onslaught. The scorched void they left behind was filled by tens of thousands of Ukrainians, who by this point were survival experts. At the time, the immediate region around Chernobyl had become hell on earth, but the Caucasus were a close second. So, to get a better idea of where the Soviet military and resources were located, I found and made numerous maps, including this one, which features all the Soviet military air bases. So, as you can see, the Soviet republics in the Caucasus, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, still not you, feature a lot of both. On top of that, clouds filled with radioactive particles turn into rain once they hit more mountainous terrain. Factor in the cultural and religious diversity of the region, and you've got a recipe for mayhem. Okay, got that? Alright. Hundreds of thousands of starving refugees, desperate for sanctuary, finding themselves trapped in the crossfire. Initially, it was every separatist faction for itself. Ossetians, Chechens, Dagestanis, and Kymiks turned against Russian minorities, retreating into the mountains, armed to the teeth. Think Afghanistan, but with a dozen competing factions clawing for survival. But it didn't stop there. Toss in some of the world's largest oil fields and an expansionist Iranian regime. While Azerbaijan boasted abundant coal and oil, its 85% Shia population drew Iran's attention. The Soviet Union's collapse pushed the world to the brink of another recession. Reagan, ever the action man, threw his support behind Saddam Hussein. Despite a 20% Muslim minority, the Soviet Union counted a mere 500 mosques and ruthlessly suppressed the religion. All that pent-up pressure would violently explode. Simultaneously, an international effort was made to support Georgia and Armenia, which were given aid, especially iodine tablets through the Black Sea. By 1988, the oil shortage was felt globally, with the economies of Mexico, Argentina, Ireland, Greece, and Yugoslavia being hit particularly hard. Cuba and Mongolia were propped up by the vast Soviet investments, and were now both belly up. As in our timeline, the Yugoslavian breakup, which occurs a little earlier, is brutal, but due to the timing and global spiral, there is far less foreign intervention. To offset the energy crisis, America turned to Venezuela, Nigeria, and Saddam, while Europe grew overly reliant on Gaddafi's Libya. Since we mentioned Afghanistan, why not talk about the real thing? I mean, Chernobyl does happen in the midst of the Soviet-Afghan war, as they failed to tame the Mujahideen. Without a leader or a government, the war-weary Soviets under the command of Marshal Sergei Sokolov very hastily get the hell out of there. But unlike Peter's organized withdrawal, this looked more like a wild scramble. These war veterans were specifically recruited from regions far from Central Asia, as early experiments showed the Soviets that locals were too sympathetic to the Afghan cause. So imagine that you're a soldier who's been at war in the deserts and mountains of Afghanistan for years. You receive a postcard saying that the entire Union is imploding, nuclear radiation is spilling out, famine is widespread, raiders are ransacking villages, and chances are your family is either dead or unreachable due to the infrastructural collapse. Treacherous terrain and enemies lie to the south, west, and east, and the road up north leads you to, let's see, a group of republics living in scattered but rich patches of land who are now rising up in revolution to form up their own nation. Oh boy. For decades, the Soviets attempted to Russify the Central Asian republics, and when that failed, they resorted to mass settlement of Russians and Ukrainians in what were now on paper the autonomous Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, all of which were majority Muslim. But in reality, the locals had only nominal control, while real power was in the hands of native Russians. And keep in mind, these are the most densely populated places east of the Ural Mountains, with Tashkent in particular being the fourth biggest city in the entire Union. In other words, the rebellious nationals were the perfect excuse for the Afghan veterans to make a living doing what they knew best. In 1986, the Soviets had just around 360,000 soldiers, and a ton of military hardware. About a quarter of it was abandoned and captured by the Afghan resistance, while the rest made their way to the Central Asian republics. The bulk of the army, following its commander, occupied the Tajik people, while other military juntas made way to the rest. But this was easier said than done. The religious element and the vindictive Afghans aided by foreign nationals including Osama bin Laden, chased the Soviets down to help the rebel republics. Out of all of them, the Kazakhs were the most widespread, and made up only 40% of the country. Excluding some pocket of resistance, the majority of them were either wiped out or fled to neighboring republics. As for the rest, within the next 3 years, the Soviets succumbed to the good old scorched earth tactic. Islamic fundamentalism grew rampant, and prevailed in the intense conflict, but at a huge cost. Numerous heritage sites and urban centers were destroyed, as with the Mongol invasions. The breakdown of trade, infrastructure, and industry meant that this part of the world would need at least a century to return to the pre-Fallout War GDP and population numbers. One massive thing to keep in mind here is that due to the distraction of the Central Asian republics and Azerbaijan, the goals of Iran, Iraq, Al-Qaeda, and the United States shift in a completely different direction. In this timeline, the Soviet renegades are seen as the biggest enemies of Islam, and, perhaps, 9/11 never happens. Of the many Siberian autonomous republics, one clearly stood out even before the fallout, and that was Buryatia. Just north of Mongolia, this harsh place was home to even harsher people. Decades prior, the state poured a considerable amount of resources and immigrants. This was a crucial stop on the Trans-Siberian Railway, and littered with military bases. These efforts meant that the local population was supplanted by Russians, and when the Union fell, the first secretary Anatoly Belyakov galvanized his people, who proclaimed him as Tsar. The founder of the new Russian dynasty made a call for all Russians seeking refuge, and began systematically enslaving all non-Russians. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and a swift victory over Tuva and Altai solidified his claim. Like Buryatia, those republics were 2/3 Russian. The natives who learned to adapt to the cold wilderness were forced to renounce their own culture, or be sent to the Gulag. By 1988, the only region in Siberia that was not part of the Russian Empire was the diminished Sakha Republic. This insanely rich land is basically like a frozen version of Arrakis. The Sakha people barely numbered 500,000, lived off the cold desert, consumed only reindeer and fish. As the world came crumbling down around them, they didn't care much. For them, the vast oil fields and coal mines only brought Russian exploiters. Glad to be rid of them, their joy turned to fury when Emperor Belyakov sent 6,000 soldiers to tame the capital of Yakutsk. It wasn't long before the snow started to speak, and no one heard from these invaders again. Enter China, eyeing a slice of the fallen Soviet pie. Led by Deng Xiaoping, Mao's successor and industrial reformer, China boasted the world's second largest economy, though its equipment paled next to the monarchy's Soviet remnants. The Tsar had no intention of making this a prolonged war against China. After all, why waste the already low manpower reserves when you got nukes? Belyakov confirmed the order, and several warheads smashed into the Gobi Desert, demonstrating his resolve. ICBMs had many fail-safe systems and required nuclear codes, but smaller nuclear warheads, such as the 2K6 Luna, could be fired from artillery guns. This is precisely what China is met with. The new Russian monarchy was desperate, with little to lose, and no diplomatic ties to consider. Deng's no fool. He understood that the risk didn't justify the reward, and he pulled the invading force, allowing the grateful Mongolians to join the empire. China was playing the long game, and they had already secured a trustworthy ally, one they could grow into a puppet state, which could then fight the proxy war for them. The Far East provinces of Russia are sparsely populated and barely industrialized. While the absence of resources and people didn't just make for great, this is why 90% of Russians live west of this line, real-life lore videos, there is not much going for this region. So why bother talking about it instead of Thatcher's failed re-election, bin Laden's war with the Soviets, or the siege of Moscow? Well, it's because we can't just forget about the Iron Fleet. The Soviet Pacific Fleet started out as the B Squad, but by the 1980s it made up 32% of its naval capability due to the arms race. 800 ships, over 120 submarines, many of which were nuclear, and 2 Kiev-class aircraft carriers. This considerable navy boasted at least 120,000 crewmen, all of which were loyal to Admiral Gennady Kvatov. Without a state to support it, and with the railway being blocked off by the new monarchy, this fleet wouldn't last long. Like the abandoned soldiers in Afghanistan, these soldiers knew they could never reach home, so they decided to make a new one. Admiral Kvatov approached Communist China and offered to sell a considerable amount of his assets in return for a steady stream of supplies and diplomatic aid. Instead of building its navy, the CCP simply bought theirs and obtained the perfect comrade to fight the crazy czarist regime. The Far East provinces are almost entirely made up of Russian immigrants who opened their arms to various admirals. Each province became a self-governing state, bound to the supreme command of Kvatov and the loose Dokotsk Federation. The cultural makeup of this new entity made it difficult for the Tsar to justify nukes, and the factions clashed in the conventional way. So yeah, there are many smaller factions in international events that I just couldn't cover in this video. For example, how amidst the chaos, Romania totally steamrolls Moldova. Big thank you to the Discord members who helped with the research for this video, and the patrons who support the channel. Once again, Conflict of Nations is a free online PvP strategy game, where you pick your nation to take on the world. Choose your strategy, and fight in epic battles. By clicking the link in the description, you get an exclusive gift, 13,000 gold, and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is limited to the next 30 days though, so don't miss out. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.